Okay, this is like Dr. Dax said, Foley. She is the outreach director at the Center for Pacific Island Studies here at UH Manoa. Some background on her: she has a BA from American University in International Studies, a master's in Nature, Society, and Environmental Governance from the University of Oxford, another master's, and also got her PhD in the Department of Geography and Environment, and also a graduate certificate in the Pacific Island Studies here. Her experience goes into grant writing, management, and evaluation through her work as a program specialist at the Hawaii Alliance for Community-Based Economic Development. But before that, she served 2 years as an AmeriCorps Vista member here in Honolulu. She also experienced in event planning and coordination, as well as social media outreach from working in Washington, D.C. as a public lands intern at the Sierra Club, a post-conflict natural resource management intern for the Environmental Law Institute, and an archival intern, and then assistant to the social secretary at the British Embassy. So without further ado.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. I come from the discipline of geography, so I am a social scientist primarily. In geography, we have both biophysical scientists and social scientists, so it's kind of a mixed discipline, similar to NREM, but my training has been much more based in qualitative research methods rather than quantitative methods. So I'll be talking a little bit about my dissertation research project, which I defended last spring and obtained my PhD. And so I'm excited to sort of hear some of your questions and thoughts as folks who intersect with environmental management and quantification and histories. And then also I have like a speech kind of prepared. So that's typical in my discipline. So I'll be kind of going between my slides and my speech here. So I will kick it off and then hopefully stay on time. So thank you so much again for welcoming me here. I'm grateful for the opportunity to study and work here on the illegally occupied lands in Manoa Valley, where the Tuahine Rains have been my welcome companion. Of course, land acknowledgements mean nothing without real changes in power, and I hope to someday live in a sovereign Hawaii where Hawaiian lands are returned to Hawaiian hands. I'd also like to begin by some thank yous. I'd like to thank my colleagues, friends, and mentors, as well as the Vanuatu Cultural Center for making this research possible. This dissertation was written with the hope that more stable climates are possible in the future. So without further ado, let's begin. So I'll start by providing an introduction. I'll discuss some of the literatures I'm drawing from, and then I'll go through each chapter in turn. And then I'd also like to thank some of my funders here, including RCUH East West Center, the University of the South Pacific Amalis campus in Vanuatu, the Fulbright Hayes Doctoral Dissertation Research Award, the Vanuatu Cultural Center, the UHM Geography Department, the College of Arts, Languages, and Letters, the College of Social Sciences, as well as UHM's Graduate Division. On my 30th birthday, Tuesday, the 25th of July, 2023, I found myself sitting in the new auditorium of the National University of Vanuatu for the opening of the Symposium of the 7th Melanesian Arts and Cultural Festival, or MACFest. It was hosted in beautiful Port Vila, Vanuatu. We received a warm Vanuatu welcome, which included a custom dance, a woven necklace, later topped up by kava and island food. In the room were scholars, performers, and practitioners from across Melanesia. The symposium theme, quote, "Rebuilding My Melanesia for Our Common Destiny," end quote, spoke to the interests of those gathered and the broader point of MACFest, to celebrate Melanesia and chart a path forward by and for the people. Central was the cherished status of Melanesian cultures, values, and custom. You can see me, I'm like all the way on the other side over there. I found myself in very good company. Scattered across the room, and many of the folks in this photo, were writers and scholars whose work I had consumed and been transformed by and through. I was happily in the minority, surrounded by scholars and writers with a deeper knowledge of Melanesia than I could ever imagine or possess. I was both generously welcomed and deeply grateful. I do not begin this story with my arrival, landing in a warm airport with the heady scent of fire in the air, because the history and importance of Vanuatu far transcend my own minor beginnings. If you'd like to read more about that, see Katerina Teoa's critique of arrivals in Chandler 2021. I begin with MacFest and with the loud celebration of Melanesian cultures and values. I begin with the festival as a convergence of culture, politics, art, research, and Melanesian pride. As Katerina Teoa explains, the Festival of Pacific Arts is not for the gaze of the tourist or the outlander. Quote, it is conceived, hosted, and presented by Pacific people for a Pacific audience, end quote. So too is MacFest. Such a celebration is necessary because, as my colleague Tarcisius Kabutalaka powerfully articulated, quote, it is daring given over 2 centuries of generally negative representations of Melanesian peoples and societies in Western discourses. Negative representations that have, over time, been internalized by Pacific Islanders, including Melanesians, and used to perpetuate relationships with Melanesia that have racist, essentialist, and social evolutionary elements. For too long, the story about climate change and the Pacific has been that of exposure and vulnerability. Once, when sharing my research on carbon offsetting in Vanuatu, I pointed to the contradiction inherent in Vanuatu's consistent classification as the world's, quote, most at-risk nation to natural hazards by the United Nations, and the nation's enduring difficulty in accessing climate finance through the Green Climate Fund and other sources. Memorably, as I finished my presentation, a scholar raised their hand, commented, so what? Their islands will be lost due to sea level rise regardless. Melanesian climate concerns and agency to resist this fate are subsumed under this suffocating narrative of islands already sunk. While this statement may be deeply callous when speaking of islands that are home to over 320,000 people, it is also instructive in exposing the dominance of a complacent view of climate change, one in which the future is already written and the seas already risen. I reject this framing, and in so doing, I draw inspiration from Katerina Teoa's work, Consuming Ocean Island, where she emphasizes, quote, of central concern are the relations between people and the land, people's relations to each other, and the relations between the past and the present, end quote. These relations form the bedrock of my work. Relations between polluters and Pacific climate warriors, the land and its colonists and Indigenous caretakers, carbon emitted during sandalwooding and carbon fixed during the past year at the Loru Conservation Area on Espiritu Santo. I also draw heavily from Ni Vanuatu writings to frame my understanding of land histories and independence. I also critique many of the works on British colonialism, mostly listed on the right side here. Importantly, many of these books view colonialism as an almost benevolent process that happened, and perhaps even, quote unquote, the good old days. Threading between frameworks in political ecology, science and technology studies, and Pacific Island studies, this dissertation holds together a bundle of knowledges on how carbon offsetting as a climate solution affects specific places and is shaped by and reshapes history. So on this side here, you can see some of the texts written by Ni Vanuatu authors describing their own context, politics, histories. I'd now like to explain how I came to this work. I am the daughter of Taryn and John Pflalzgraf. That's them in the bottom. My mother is a writer and my father is an arborist. So in a way, I've accidentally done what all children fear. Through this process, I've become both of my parents more. But I am grateful for their love and support all these years, especially when I travel very far away to Vanuatu. To study in Vanuatu, where lands were returned to Indigenous landowners upon independence in 1980, is a privilege, accident, and responsibility. A privilege because I have no genealogical connection to these stories shared with me by over 50 generous scholars, government workers, nonprofit staff members, community leaders, and friends in the course of this research. An accident because I happened to find a master's research project through my friend, Lord Jernigan, in the bottom corner there, who was then a Peace Corps volunteer in Vanuatu, when we were discussing disempowering representations of the island nation after the devastating impacts of Cyclone Pam in 2015. A responsibility because so many meals of island cabbage and simboro, shells of kava in conversations in cafes, and in backs of trucks have been shared with me. Weddings and funerals, joys and sadnesses alike. I'm not just a researcher, but also now a sister, friend, and community member. I'm reminded, quote, entry is not negotiated once only. It is done on a continuous basis and at all levels of the research exercise, end quote, Nabobo Baba. I continue to work towards earning these permissions. Yet, as Tengan and Haraniko have shown, Indigenous scholars bring deeper insights into research with their own communities. Such a pathway is not available to me as a settler scholar on this research project. So I remain ambivalent in my research. I treasure the opportunity to learn, I acknowledge my partiality, and at times regret the privileges that I've been afforded. In the pages that follow, I do not try to tell the story of carbon offsetting in Vanuatu, but to create space for dialogue and engagement with the complex relations which enable trees to become money. Sorry, my slides got out of order. So this research does not use typical climate research methods, but rather leverages a qualitative approach inspired by the insights developed by critical and Indigenous scholars over the past 2 decades. In attempting to create space in this research for greater dialogue and Pacific ways of knowing, I use both structured interviews and talk story or storian, which is a Pacific engaged research methodology. While I'm sure I imperfectly carried out these conversations, they were importantly conversations, a flow back and forth of information and questions. I also took an approach of waiting in this work. I waited for introductions, for access, and for approval. I found myself on the timelines of my collaborators, and I'm certain that my work is richer for the waiting. In my studies, I frequently reflected on this quote by Grace Marimolisa, one of Vanuatu's most beloved writers. She writes, quote, "What truth is there in the definitions and descriptions by an outsider who has never met nor seen us and is totally ignorant of our habitat and environment," end quote. I take her critique seriously. I do not seek to tell the history of the forest in Vanuatu, but rather to compile the diverse stories and data which I've gathered and received over a patchwork of the past 6 years with the support of many of my research collaborators. So I draw together excerpts and information from 50 interviews conducted in person on Efate, Pentecost, Ambrim, and Santo, which are 4 islands in Vanuatu, and also virtual interviews in the strange world of Zoom during the global pandemic. These oral records and quilted patches of ethnography are complemented by archival research conducted at the Vanuatu National Archives and the Pacific Collection here at Hamilton Library, as well as a review of existing published works and gray literature, including nonprofit reports and governmental reports, documents. And I also drew from many conversations over the Kava Bowl, the Tanoa, and long talks with Tara at Manoa Gardens and many other less formal means. While I optimistically claim slightly more credibility than to be totally ignorant, I do believe the work of writing Vanuatu's forest history remains incomplete and can only be enriched by more writers, musicians, storytellers, dancers, chiefs, and women, particularly from Vanuatu, taking this project forward. So now I'll go through each chapter in brief, so you can kind of get an impression of what I cover, and then we'll get to some questions at the end. So chapter 2 is called From Colonial Science to Climate Capacity Building, Analyzing Inequities in Climate Knowledge Access in Vanuatu. This piece was published in GeoForum in 2021. I'd like to begin by discussing the multi-million-dollar Increasing Resilience to Climate Change and Natural Hazards program, a partnership between the Global Environment Facility, European Commission, and Vanuatu government, which described its second primary component as such, quote, Presently, there is limited capacity for the capture, storage, and analysis of a range of geophysical, hydrological, and climate-related data, and their use in planning and mapping, as well as the ability to undertake detailed vulnerability assessments, which is necessary to accurately identify and understand the risks and response requirements associated with climate change and climate-related disaster risk reduction. End quote. While Vanuatu certainly faces data collection and processing challenges, the root causes of these problems are obscured by the project, a common and often criticized weakness of many development interventions. The European nations of England and France colonized Vanuatu for just under 100 years, and this history of scientific, economic, and social exploitation is essential to understanding contemporary capacity issues and comparatively high vulnerability. Climate research often avoids questions around knowledge production itself. Who knows what they know about climate change at different scales? So here I have a table that compiles the history of climate sensors in Vanuatu. So scientific knowledge production and colonialism are deeply entangled. The colonies were viewed as living laboratories to test out new forms of political, social, economic, and environmental control. The establishment of weather monitoring was often for economic means, such as securing trade routes across the sea or air, rather than benevolently improving knowledges of a specific place. So weaving together information from interviews with officials, historical sources, and contemporary climate research provides an idea of where and when climate data in Vanuatu comes from, as you can see in this table. So all 7 of Vanuatu's primary meteorological stations at Sola, Pecoa, Lamap, Bowerfield, Port Vila, Whitegrass, and Engelhot were established during the colonial era. Only 6 of Vanuatu's 83 islands, or roughly 7%, have longstanding observational records. The sites in Table 1 are also largely coastal, reflecting the preference of colonists to live away from the bush and near to their economic interests and the ports. One of the longer-running stations was located at Iririki Island in Port Vila Bay, which was the site of the British High Commissioner's residence. 5 of the 6 islands with records of climate observation, Efate, Espiritu Santo, Anaichum, Malakula, and Tana, were sites of economic importance during the sandalwood trade, blackbirding, and plantation eras. The location of climate observation sites was more influenced by enterprise and colonial extraction than science, a fact often obscured by perceptions of climate science as objective and decoupled from colonialism. As places were brought into global circulations of knowledge and capital through colonial sciences, many places were also rendered invisible because they were not deemed of value to the colonial governments. 93% of Vanuatu's islands fell into this obscurity. Notably, the development of the global economy, although foundational to the origins of global climate study, often remains outside discussions within contemporary climate science. These colonial policies continue to have an impact today, as an interviewee who worked for the government explains. Quote, measurement of data is mostly across the coasts. That is a challenge. Rainfall is very variable. We don't have any data on the interior. The data coverage needs to be improved, especially for rainfall, which is very sensitive for people. It will affect drinking water, agriculture, everything, end quote. Broadly, I argue a lack of climate knowledge is not due to weakness on the part of individuals or the Vanuatu state, but rather the result of interrelated processes of colonialism, economics, science, and politics. The primary contributions of this chapter to the literature include revealing the connections between colonial science and contemporary climate knowledge, offering a critique of climate research and capacity building projects that fail to account for colonial histories, exploring the inequalities in climate knowledge experienced by scientists and policymakers in Vanuatu, and extending theorizations of climate justice and vulnerability to account for these knowledge inequities. Next, I'll pivot to chapter 3, which focuses on situating the forest, or more broadly, contextualizing forest history in Vanuatu. As carbon fluxes and climate shifts play out on a planetary scale over centuries rather than years, exploring forest histories beyond the boundaries imposed by contemporary climate mechanisms reveals the deep roots, to borrow a tree phrase, of emissions by colonial powers and the significant impacts of colonial accumulation on forests and people. As Zimmer aptly stated, quote, "Commodities are not, they become." So on the slide here, you can see some maps of Vanuatu, and then you can also specifically see the island of Espiritu Santo in a artistic form. So, quote, "Vanuatu means the islands, the people that existed and still exist and will always exist," end quote. So the name Vanuatu asserts the deep history of the people, the land, their relations, and the perpetuity of the sovereign nation of Vanuatu. The people of Vanuatu have long thrived on their islands, developed advanced adaptive practices over centuries and generations, as well as maintaining some of the most linguistic and cultural diversity in the world. John Beeson describes the arrival of white men to Vanuatu as, quote, "The story of the way the people of the islands have resisted every attempt to break the bond that ties them to their lands," end quote. Indeed, De Quiros landing in 1606 began a pattern whereby Europeans landed, demanded, and when thwarted, murdered, and Ni Vanuatu communities resisted this dispossession at every turn. So I'll kind of go over like 200 years of history very quickly, so please bear with me. From 1825 to 1865, the sandalwood, or the Santalum austrocaladonicum, boom generated substantial deforestation, environmental degradation, economic accumulation, and significantly carbon emissions, and wealth for Australian and English businessmen. The trade is credited with nearly eradicating the fragrant tree from Vanuatu's forests, where it remains rare today. Following the collapse of the sandalwood trade due to overexploitation, appalling land grabs proceeded through the latter quarter of the 19th century. By 1905, the Société Française de Nouvelles Hébrides, and subsidized by the French government, had acquired significant tracts and, on paper, claimed 55% of all lands in Vanuatu. Exemplifying the disingenuity of these claims, one large tract on Tana Island was bought for a single blanket. Land acquisition and clearing was frequently met with Indigenous resistance. Following the damaging sandalwood trade, blackbirding, the often involuntary importation of labor from South Pacific islands to Australia and Fiji, which was likened to slavery, proceeded from 1863 to 1904. During this period, approximately 50,000 Ni Vanuatu people circulated between their home islands and colonial plantations. As people were displaced from their lands, Europeans moved in and ceded plantations. To steal land, Europeans enshrined themselves as superior, deeming Ni Vanuatu disposable to their ultimate goal of economic development and profit accumulation. Racism was instrumental in the colonization of Vanuatu and facilitated outright land theft and legal manipulation to ensure white land claims were upheld at the cost of Indigenous rights and well-being. I'd like to pivot to these quotes here. So, quote, "Planters go to the islands to get fertile land for virtually nothing, which they cannot do under a civilized government," end quote. Quote, "Manual labor is performed by native laborers, and the white man's energies are devoted solely to the directing and supervising of the hands," end quote. So in a lot of these texts, they're very explicit about the racial order that they are imposing on the islands, and they don't hide it. They don't have any claims that they're bettering anyone. They are like very explicit about the racial domination that they are bringing to this place. So the primary contributions of this largely historical chapter include that the colonization of the New Hebrides was marked by consistent and enduring failure. So the society for the, so both the English and the French side had multiple colonies they set up, and they just consistently failed. Like the colonists would plant and all their plants would die, and so then they'd go back to Australia, or they would get dengue and not make it through the next season. And yet there's this kind of view that colonization worked. But if you look at the historical record, almost every single settlement effort was marked by this failure. And also there was like very, very significant government investment to continue this process over many years. Additionally, Indigenous Vanuatu resistance to land dispossession and colonial extraction was sustained and ultimately successful. I try to dispel the myth of the benign British colonist by outlining these racialized capital logics, including land theft, white supremacy, and legal manipulation. And I also try to assert the climate impacts of colonialism through noting the sandalwood trade and carbon impacts related to that, and the impacts of clearing land for creating new plantations. And for chapter 4, I look specifically more at the recent era, and I explore fixing the forest in Vanuatu, the remaking of forests in search of finance. And I use fixing to have double meaning. So on March 26, 2016, Hannington Tate, Vanuatu's then director of the Forestry Department, declared 3 interrelated initiatives. First, an annual tree planting day and forest week, as well as the decade of reforestation, which is just ending now. That same year, approximately 30,000 wildlings of mahogany were planted across the archipelago. While such holidays are regularly celebrated by many across the world, their emergence in Vanuatu provides a compelling opportunity to consider how global climate finance flows are reshaping landscapes and livelihoods in novel ways, sometimes before ever arriving to the islands. It's particularly interesting because there is no clear record of deforestation in the present era in Vanuatu. Yet, Vanuatu's leaders consider reforestation as key to their approach to climate adaptation, mitigation, and development. In 2016, Director Tate simply explained, quote, "We will use tree growing as a weapon to halt climate change," end quote. Such an approach is deemed necessary because Vanuatu faces significant climate impacts that need to be adapted to or mitigated, while bearing almost no responsibility for global CO2 emissions. Since 2015, loss and damage related to cyclones alone in Vanuatu, which includes Cyclone Pam, Harold, Kevin, and Judy, accounted for nearly $1.5 billion in losses and damages. But accessing climate finance has continued to be a challenge. As of 2023, Vanuatu had not yet received any payments for ecosystem services under REDD+. This slow trickle of climate finance to Vanuatu speaks to a broader contradiction within environmental policy on a global scale. Market-based interventions, such as REDD+, or reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, dominate policy proposals, and yet they remain persistently marginal in actually addressing global environmental problems. So I'll go through kind of a brief history of carbon offsetting, which may be familiar or unfamiliar to some of you folks. So in 1977, Freeman Dyson, a sort of kind of renegade physicist character, wrote, quote, "It is highly unlikely that the particular emergency program here proposed will ever be implemented. My discussion of it is enormously oversimplified," end quote. Yet his idea has, in fact, been widely implemented globally. Dyson's other ideas, such as the Dyson sphere, a hypothetical structure surrounding a star and harnessing its solar energy, and the Dyson tree, a genetically modified tree capable of producing a livable environment within a comet, have not been similarly successful, except, of course, within the pages of science fiction novels. Planting trees to reduce carbon emissions or forest-based carbon sequestration, commonly referred to as carbon offsetting, continues to grow with $5.2 billion expended on the flagship UN REDD and REDD+ program since 2008, with funding continuing to increase annually. Although highly unlikely and enormously oversimplified, tree planting for carbon reduction is now a primary climate mitigation strategy, receiving significant investment and political attention from the local to the global scale. As reported by The Guardian, quote, "REDD+ is, among many other things, a beautiful idea, akin to growing money on trees." In brief, Dyson's plan relies on the creation of massive plantations of the American sycamore. Dyson proposed, quote, "The cost would perhaps be lower if most of the planting were done by labor-intensive methods in countries where labor is cheap," end quote. From the very beginning, carbon offsetting relied upon a spatial fix to relocate the costs of mitigation away from the source of emissions. He particularly thought Africa would be a great place for thousands of acres of American sycamore. In 1987, the AES Corporation, a fossil fuel production company, thought that maybe their activities were causing climate change and sought a strategy to fix this issue when building a new power plant in Connecticut. AES and the World Resources Institute estimated that 52 million trees would be needed to balance the emissions of this new coal power plant over its 40-year lifetime. Of course, there happened to be neither space nor resources to purchase land in Connecticut for such an undertaking as Dyson had estimated, so the company looked further south. Faith et al., the scholars at at WRI, directly cite Dyson and argue that working within the US would be, quote, considerably more expensive, end quote. Judged by cost, carbon offsetting was deemed a more efficient solution to climate change than emissions avoidance or source reductions. However, reducing source emissions by not building a new coal power plant would have been a much more efficient solution, particularly as the benefits of the AES project in Guatemala were vastly overestimated. Ultimately, 270,000 tons of carbon offset, or only 1.8% of the proposed amount, as research 10 years after the project found. Understanding the historical roots, to borrow a tree phrase, of forest carbon offsetting provides a means of revealing the contingent and shifting alliances of carbon offsetting's growth. Tim Forsyth noted that, quote, we need to see the evolution of environmental facts and knowledge as part of the political debate, rather than as a pre-prepared basis from which to start environmental debate. In completing this research, I found echoes of development and conservation suffuse climate mitigation and adaptation programs. Indeed, many of the same bingos or big international NGOs are involved in conservation throughout the 1990s are the same ones supporting carbon offsetting. Red Plus in particular draws from understandings of, quote, conservation as development to pitch climate change mitigation as development. If Vanuatu's forests remain generally protected and well managed, Vanuatu will be unable to access mitigation and adaptation funding due to Red Plus and carbon offsetting's focus on generating additionality. Long-term, low forest-based emissions are not to be celebrated under carbon offsetting, despite the obvious climate benefits of low emissions. Instead, such careful management is a barrier to accessing one of the largest sources of funding available to support developing nations' transitions to a low-carbon economy and adaptation to climate shifts. In addition, Brock, a scientific forester in 1998, was assessing sustainable pathways for forest use in Vanuatu and argued, quote, a major drawback of traditional land tenure systems is that they are not suited to a market economy, end quote. Custom, or the indigenous practices of managing land, thus becomes a barrier to efficient use and development, reflecting a broader problem or broader pattern whereby forest-based peoples and their practices are considered backward and in need of transformation or betterment by scientists and policymakers from outside. Red continues to perpetuate these false narratives. Finally, the framing of smallholders as a threat to Vanuatu's forests leads to the dominance and implementation of particular environmental management regimes which prioritize the removal or restricted access of smallholders, as well as government intervention through formalized leases. Yet, in Vanuatu, rural communities certainly use forest resources, but importantly, these same communities have implemented and maintained taboos and conservation sites for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. Walking through the rural landscape in Vanuatu, particularly on Pentecost, Ambrim and Santo, I frequently spotted such taboo sites. So this chapter, I follow Sultana's paper in 2022 and draw from the histories explored in the prior chapter. I try to explore how, quote, climate change lays bare the colonialism of not only the past, but an ongoing coloniality that governs and structures our lives, which are co-constitutive of processes of capitalism, imperialism, and international development, end quote. Climate change is not the first apocalypse brought by the West to Oceania and must be understood within this broader historical context. Carbon offsetting from its inception has always relied on spatial and temporal fixes, including the dislocation of sources and sinks from high to low emitting nations. Climate solutions are consistently limited by concerns around return on investment, feasibility, leakage, and additionality. Carbon offsetting also reinscribes many of the same narratives and contestations from conservationist development projects from 20 to 30 years ago. And finally, carbon offsets not only provide spatiotemporal fixes, but also fix the system proposed for emissions reductions in favor of polluting and imperial nations. And then I'll go really quickly through this one, which is about Indigenous alternatives of recovering following an ecological disaster on Ambai Island. In this chapter, I explore the Monaro eruption with the lens of disasters not as acts of God or momentary ruptures in stability, but as long-term processes of the uneven and unjust generation of vulnerability. This is akin to Horowitz's efforts to, quote, grapple with the unsettling truth that disasters have histories, end quote. Yet acknowledging how vulnerability is generated over the long term is not enough. Disasters of matters of life and death, and uplifting alternative pathways where more life and more justice are possible is essential. As climate change continues to endanger communities in Vanuatu and across Oceania, Indigenous responses to ecological crises critically provide spaces of recovery and healing, as well as alternatives to capitalist imperial solutions. Centering Indigenous Melanesian disaster recovery practices aligns with broader theoretical interventions that acknowledge Melanesian alternatives. Contemporary coverage of the Monaro disaster by the Vanuatu Daily Post, one of the most popular papers in Vanuatu, exemplifies a multi-sided and multivocal narrative of both the eruption and recovery. I analyzed 54 articles, which revealed that custom was the concept most frequently invoked to legitimize disaster recovery pathways, followed closely by chiefly authority. Custom is expansively defined as what the Vanuatu people consider to be their own traditions, knowledges, and practices, perceived as a, quote, total way of life. While the government initially envisioned the relocation of Ambayans to large plots of land on a nearby island, Mewo, the policy shifted to more intimate, customary reunions completed on a family-by-family basis on Mewo and Santo. Originally termed customary adoption, the chiefs renamed the practice customary reunion to acknowledge shared genealogies and enduring familial relations. This facilitated the allocation of land to those who were displaced by disaster, not as outsiders who are coming in to take away from the community, but as long-lost relatives who are once again being integrated. These shared histories and the willingness of chiefs to acknowledge these connections enabled the allocation of land to disaster survivors as members of broadened communities. In addition, while Vanuatu customary tenure practices facilitate the distribution of land to those in need, there is also flexibility in how the land can be used. Here's also like just a history of eruptions on the island. So this article primarily explains that sovereignty and land return can be brought into conversation with broader discussions about land back. It asserts the importance of custom as an Indigenous solution to ecological catastrophe, and it explores the possibility of Indigenous solutions to climate change. Now I'd like to summarize a few key conclusions I draw from this work more broadly. First, climate change is happening to specific people in specific places, and providing a place-based analysis of climate change over generations and decades reveals the deeper roots of inequality, accumulation, and our climate debts. Tracing resource histories, forest-based logics, and the carbon of forest-based reveals the logic which underpin them and enable us to consider more fully their contributions to resolving our present crises. I also deepen Carton's theorizations of the spatiotemporal fix and, quote, commodification of everything, putting offsets into historical context and in place. I also trace the imperial imaginaries which continue to enable polluters such as the US to, quote, fix the system in their favor by exploring how environmental management regimes come to be, and looking at the science and deeper historical trajectories of environmental change. I also hope to reveal more just pathways and possible alternatives. 3, colonialism and land dispossession did not just happen, but were actively resisted over centuries, and the resistance ultimately won. I assert that to understand climate futures, we must look to Vanuatu. The nation has led decades of climate activism, won considerably, and continues to change the world. In fact, the Vanuatu-led campaign for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, the ruling just came out this past July, and it was in favor of Vanuatu. So I can kind of go over that in the Q&A section if folks are interested. For future directions, in the course of this research, I read Scheinberg's History of the Sandalwood Trade, and I'd like to make an effort to quantify the carbon impact of the eradication of sandalwood in Vanuatu, and then use that to explore ideas of reparations or climate debt. Sandalwood's work's really interesting because she has the log diameters for all of the logs that were exported. So I think that would be an interesting project. Maybe someone in this room, if you're interested, you could let me know. I also did not find a lot of information on mining and forest use during the condominium era, which was about 1910 to 1980. It would be useful to deepen my understanding of those years through additional research. I actually found out that the British government illegally stole and burned a lot of their colonial files because they were embarrassing to the nation. And it's now referred to as, quote, the secret archive, and they have a special room at the National Archives at Kew that researchers can now access after a landmark case in 2014, brought to the UK by the independence movement in Kenya. In addition, I've also been inspired by Kavelau Wright's work on land dispossession in Hawaii, and there's many similarities between the processes employed in Hawaii and in Vanuatu. And it would be interesting to kind of explore how these colonial histories intersect. Kavelau found that some of the territorial government officers went to Aotearoa, New Zealand, to learn from how the British were doing it there so that they could more effectively dispossess lands here. And because of the proximity of many of these places, it would be interesting to kind of explore those connections more. And then finally, I want to once more thank all of the people who made this research possible, particularly my friends and collaborators in Vanuatu. And I just have one more paragraph and then you can stop listening to me. In attempting to correct the record of research on climate change, I've taken seriously Julian Agin's entreaty to write, quote, write as if everything they love is on the line, because it is, end quote. I love Vanuatu and I love Hawaii. I love the sounds of the birds in the morning and going for a walkabout. I love the opportunity to learn and the pressure it brings to try to put things as right as I can. And so I write with Vanuatu, the land and people at the center. I write committed to a future in which the islands of the South Pacific remain thriving and abundant, as rich in self-governance as in breadfruit, where the beloved ocean is not a foe biting at eroding shores, but an open highway, well-traveled and known. Thank you, Tomas.